Do not wait until the conditions are perfect to begin. Beginning makes the conditions perfect. Alan Cohen.
Join me as we jump into the Autism Navigation Pod. What was the process like for you actually finding that ABA provider after you did all the research and figured out that you wanted to give it a shot? Like researching companies, how did you find them? What was the intake process like, and kind of like calling to like the first day the ABA started?
Yeah. So again, another frustrating part of the whole process. You've got the diagnosis. They've told you early intervention is the most important thing. And now you have to be on a waiting list that's a year to a year and a half to get your child into ABA therapy. And I set out to find ABA for my son at all costs, and I was not going to wait a year and a half to a year to get it for him because it was important for early intervention. So I got from my insurance company a list of their providers, and I put him on every wait list that I could find. And then I started researching the companies after I got them on the wait list. We actually went to several different places and looked at their facilities because with ABA, some people do a facility ABA and some do in-home. And as I started to do research, I did not feel comfortable about the facility ABA's setting, just because I wanted to be involved in the process. That was something that was very important to me and my husband, is that if we're going to do this, we want to make sure that it's good ABA and that we're involved. But it was not just about that. It was also about educating ourselves on what we needed to do to help him to do the best. And if he was not where we could see and where we could ask questions and learn, then we weren't going to learn on how to help him. The other thing is that I actually went to a place that they had a school, so he could go to school, have ABA therapy there and everything. And the thing that we did not feel comfortable with that, I think that it works well for a lot of people, but the reason why we chose not to do that, well, there was several reasons why. The first one was that it was like 45 minutes away. And so I would have to drive him 45 minutes away, come home for 45 minutes, leave him there. And I didn't feel comfortable with leaving him all day. He was only 3 years old, just turning 4. And I didn't want him going all day. I felt like that was too much for him. And the other part of it is that I didn't necessarily want schooling to be in a setting like that where he didn't have other examples of neurotypical kids. If they all fit into that category of autism, then where was he going to get those examples of what was going on with life and what the goal was? So at that point, I was super frustrated because I was on these waiting lists. And again, I went to the parent support group, and the company that we ultimately went with had come in and had a discussion with the parents at the parent support group. The month before, I actually missed it, but they all talked about it. And they actually didn't have a waiting list because they were a fairly new company. And so their waiting list wasn't out there. And so I called and we started the process of getting our insurance approved because our insurance was not, they weren't a provider because they were fairly new. So they weren't a provider with our insurance, but they were able to get a single case agreement with my insurance to be able to help Trip. And so we went from having to wait a year to a year and a half. And every other place that I had on a wait list, it was actually facility based. And so I wasn't super thrilled about that either. And this just kind of landed exactly the way that we wanted it to land. And so that's how we found the company.
We're the perfect guest for today's podcast. She's been the recipient of behavior analytic services in her home. She's a behavior analyst. She's a business owner of the company Manning Behavior Services. She's the president of the Utah Association for Behavior Analysis. She's worked in schools as a teacher, a principal, consultant, and probably a few more areas for 20 plus years. And she's a really good personal friend. She's one of the most genuine, empathetic, altruistic people I've had the chance to meet. So I'm very excited to share an amazing person with our audience today. Christine Manning. Christine, how are you?
I'm well, Jesse. Thank you. That was the sweetest introduction ever.
Well, it's very well deserved, and I'm excited for us to be able to learn from you today.
Well, thank you so much. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So today we're talking about getting started with services and really like figuring out who is going to be a good fit within the service industry and how to kind of navigate that. So first things first, Christine, where can families find information about service providers and how to get a hold of them?
Well, generally, their doctors might refer them to a list of potential providers to provide ABA services to their families. Then it's just kind of a matter of getting on and making those phone calls to see who has availability in their schedule, what kind of insurance they take, and things like that. Another option would be to go to the directories in the different insurance companies, and some of them have a directory list of providers listed there on their websites or other places. So it can be a variety of places to get connected to a provider.
Perfect. So when families do get connected to a provider, when they get through, they, are able to talk to a live person, where do they start? What questions should they be asking to these providers? How can they kind of assess whether a provider is going to be a good fit for their child's needs?
That's a great question. And there are so many options out there. First of all, if a parent actually gets through to a live person, that's a good day. Many times they end up leaving a message and sometimes are called back a few days later and sometimes not at all, unfortunately. I know the field is very busy, but I think that in and of itself, whether you receive a call back or an answer, is a good indicator of potential services that you might get with your family, for your family. There are many different providers with different expertise and different levels of experience, years of experience. So I think it's important when you do connect with a provider that you think may be able to provide services for your family, that you do ask a lot of questions. Sometimes as a provider, I feel like I'm the one with all of the questions that need to be asked, but I think parents need to be empowered to do their own research into that provider to see if they're going to be a good fit for their family. So for example, some providers have experience with ABA themselves as a parent or a caregiver of a child with a disability. That's going to give that provider a deeper understanding of what it is like being a parent of a child with a disability. Some providers have had decades of experience in the field, and they have had a lot of families that they've worked with over the years that have given them a really good base of understanding and working with families with children with disabilities. So I think it's good to ask questions, see if you're a fit, not only as far as experience and expertise go, but also cultural differences and other considerations that a family might take into account when they're asking questions of their provider.
Mhm. I think it's so important for families to know that, like you said, they can be empowered. They should be asking questions, and it's one of the most important decisions I think a family can make. So I think those examples that you provided are invaluable as families are on a quest to find someone who's going to really like help their family out and their child out.
Yeah, and I think, this person is going to be in your home, sitting on your sofa, helping your child wash their hands in your bathroom, sitting on the floor, maybe going into public with you. They're going to become part of your family. So if you don't feel comfortable with them, or you're not sure how you trust them, or you're not sure that they communicate appropriately or frequently enough for what your needs are, then that probably is somebody that you want to look at and decide if this is somebody that you really want to work with that closely long term.
Mhm. Yeah. Um, it's typically a lot of hours in the home, so I think it's a great consideration too. How would you recommend, or in your experience on kind of both sides of behavior analytic services, how would you recommend families weigh out like waiting lists versus like their top tier, their first choice in provider?
Gosh, Jesse, that's such a difficult question because oftentimes we're in a hurry to get our child, we're in a hurry to get help for our child, and we don't want to wait. However, I feel like having a good fit and having somebody that you truly trust and communicates well and is in alignment with your ideals is probably more important than being the first person on the wait list. There are service providers who maybe not show up to the home as often as they should. Some parents report that they never even knew they had a BCBA, or they've never talked to the owner of a company. And I understand that companies are larger. Some companies are larger than others, but I think it's really important for families to not be in such a hurry because services can be not quality enough that you may want to determine if that service is even worth keeping. And that's hard on you, it's hard on your child. And it's just better to make the right choice from the beginning.
Yeah, in some of our earlier podcasts, we talked about the diagnostic process or the evaluation process and how to interpret the results and what to expect when families are going into the evaluation process. And one of the things that's results from that oftentimes is a recommendation to get started with services as quickly as possible. And I think that can instill a sense of urgency that maybe and maybe compromise for parents that shouldn't necessarily be there or wouldn't be there otherwise without that recommendation. And not to say it's not a great recommendation or an important recommendation, but I think sometimes families will just go with whomever um, is most readily available. And sometimes it's a great fit. And sometimes, like I know that I've met families who wish they would have waited for their second, the second most available provider. Has that also like been your experience?
Yes, and I think it's so hard, Jesse, because it's families are often desperate for help. And so if you have somebody there extending a hand to say, I will help you, you want to be helped as soon as possible. And we also know that early intervention is key. And so when you're on a wait list or you're looking through providers and having meetings, oftentimes it can get pretty timely. It can take weeks and sometimes even months to find a good fit. And then by the time you get started on the authorization process, then you're even adding more time onto that. But I do have experience where families have said to me, I wish we would have looked a little bit more into the ABA companies before we just jumped in and started services with a company that may not be the best fit for their family. So it's kind of a catch-22 there. It's just hard to wait when you need help.
Hmm. Absolutely. As we know, there's a lot of dual diagnoses. So kids with autism oftentimes have other diagnoses as well, things like oppositional defiance disorder, uh, ADHD, things along those lines. Would you say that's important for families to talk to potential providers about? And if so, to what extent should they be disclosing like some of that information or some of the challenges that go along with those diagnoses?
Well, I think 100% they should ask and also let their providers know of any comorbid diagnoses. I think about the clients that I've served in my own clinical practice as well as in the community in the schools, and I don't know that I know of any that just have one diagnosis. Many times there are multiple diagnoses with a child. And so as a provider, on one hand, we're looking at behavior and changing behavior and teaching skills. But on the other hand, I think a provider having experience or at least some understanding of some of those comorbid diagnoses is important. I know that we have children that have comorbid diagnoses of autism and Down syndrome. Those are things that have an intellectual component to it that a provider may want to have a deeper understanding of before they just dive in and take a client that they may not understand fully. If you don't understand a diagnosis or how to work with an individual, it makes behavior change and skill acquisition a little bit more difficult. And so I think having that understanding as a provider is important. And I think it's okay for parents to ask, what experience have you got? My child has Down syndrome, or my child has explosive behavior disorder, or OCD or pica. I mean, there are so many comorbid disabilities that could be part of that diagnosis. And it's important that the provider has experience and has expertise to help those individual kids with their needs so that they can provide the best services possible.
Yeah, and as behavior analysts, it's even in our ethics code that we need to know, we need to be educated in the different areas that we're supporting people. So I think that is such a great answer and so like empowering for families. A little bit earlier, you mentioned something about an authorization process. I know there's insurance mandates, and typically Medicaid covers ABA services. So this I may be setting you up for a difficult question here, Christine. But what does that authorization process in general entail, and how can families be prepared to speed that up to the extent they're able?
Sure, that's a great question because I feel like many times we go ahead and decide a family as a good fit for us. We're a good fit for that family. And then families are expecting that within a week or two, we are in their home providing services to their child. And I wish that was the case, but it isn't. There is quite a significant amount of work to be done before services can actually be provided. So we start with getting a copy of the front and back of the person's insurance card. Then the provider will generally call the insurance company to make sure that they are in network and can provide ABA services to that family, and that there aren't any restrictions or services that may be restricted at all. And then after they have that information, they'll usually get the benefits and find out what the family's co-pays and deductibles and all of those things are, to communicate that with the family so that they know a little bit about where they stand as far as payment would be concerned, and what portion of ABA might be covered or not covered via their insurance. After that's done, there's usually an intake process from providers. I know that some providers will send a Google form or some other kind of form via email or online for the caregiver to fill out and submit. I like to do mine in person or live online via virtual meeting, just so that I can be face to face with that caregiver, so that they can see me and I can understand what they're saying, and we really connect at that point. I really want to understand their family and understand their child, and I want them to know that I'm listening and I care about those answers. So we'll go through that intake process, and then we will put in the submit for insurance for assessment. And that generally takes a couple of weeks, 2 to 4 weeks, depending on the insurance company and how far they're backed up. But when you put in your paperwork to insurance, you'll submit your request form. You'll submit, some insurance companies require a prescription from the physician for ABA services. And then you'll submit their documentation to show that they have a diagnosis of autism. And the assessments that were given, sometimes it's in the form of a neuropsychological evaluation from a doctor or a neuropsychologist or a psychiatric physician of some sort. So you'll submit that to insurance, and then they go through and they decide if they're eligible to receive services, and then they will send you back an approval. After you have that approval, then you can go through and conduct your own assessment, which will inform your treatment plan. You'll put goals on there that are in line with the skill deficits from the assessment, and also goals that the parents and or other caregivers feel are important for that child under the umbrella of what's in the ABA purview. And then you'll submit that treatment plan to insurance to get the final authorization so that you can begin those sessions that generally happen on a daily or weekly basis. So sometimes between the time the insurance company gets back to you and busy providers schedule the time to conduct the assessments and work with the families, sometimes that can take upwards of 6 weeks or longer to get that all approved in order to start providing services. And I think that's one of the most important things that families understand, is that even if a provider really has a quick turnaround and can write that treatment plan and do the assessment quickly, they still have the wait time on the insurance company to provide those authorizations prior to moving forward with those sessions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's a lot. So just, is it okay if I kind of like bullet point recap that process, and then you can tell me if it's accurate or not accurate, or fill in any gaps in the midst? Okay.
Please do. So, I think I went forward and then had to go backwards a little bit. So yes, bullet point that.
Perfect. Okay. So there is, like at first, for families to prepare, they contacted providers. They should have their insurance card or Medicaid card, and then their evaluations handy, comprehensive, autism, etc., and then a prescription if needed. The provider can kind of help identify whether or not that's required for that insurance or that funder, and then everything's submitted. We get an authorization. The provider goes in and does a skills assessment, some more information from families. They write a treatment plan. They send all that back in to insurance, and they get a second authorization. And that's when we can get up and running and started with ongoing ABA services. Does that seem about right?
That is correct. And it should be noted also that first initial authorization is what takes the bulk of the time. So just getting started with services. Once services are going, your provider will have a seamless reintegration for every 6-month authorization that needs to be provided by insurance, so that there should not be a lapse in coverage once coverage begins. So that first part is the time that parents need to be the most patient and understand that there is a process for us to abide by.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's unfortunate. I think in a perfect world, we would get a call, go out and visit the family, write a treatment plan, and get started within a couple of days, especially when we have, like amazing staff who are available and ready to go and trained and just do amazing things for our incredible families. Unfortunately, that's, I would say, the exception to the rule, which is unfortunate.
Yeah, and I agree. And it's not that providers don't want to provide that help. We can empathize with families. We want to help families, but there is that process that we have to go through just to make sure that everything is in place so that coverage is is authorized to be paid for. So we wouldn't want something to happen where for any reason something wasn't covered, but we've already started providing services and then the parents can't pay, nor can they really even get treatment from you for some reason. And so it can be really tricky. But like I said, it's really only that initial authorization, and then things are pretty smooth after that.
And that's when, you know, we see all that progress. Christine, before we let you go, is there anything that we didn't give you an opportunity to talk about? Anything that would be helpful for families? Anything that they should know that that kind of goes along the lines of identifying service providers, getting started, anything like that?
I don't think there's necessarily anything specifically. I do think that as a parent is reaching out to determine if a provider is a good fit for them, to understand that some providers have things like minimum hours of mandatory weekly sessions. And so just seeing if that provider will be a good fit for your family as far as what their restrictions are on providing services. So for example, some companies mandate a minimum of 15 hours per week. And when you have children in school, or you have, multiple children, that you have things after school in the evenings and other things like that, it can be tricky to balance having 3 hours of ABA after school. And not only is that tricky to balance as far as activities and things like that, but your kids are tired. And so really asking your ABA company and your provider, what are your requirements for families to receive ABA through your company? Because not all companies have the same provisions. And so finding someone that will be not only a fit personality-wise and communication, all those other things, but as far as actual services that are being provided, if they have a 15-hour per week minimum, families would need to commit to that. And that might be difficult for some families. However, on the provider side, the more hours you have, depending on the nature of the disability and the skills that need to be learned, the more time we have with your child, the better. But we also don't want to be taking away from things like going to grandma's house and going swimming and being part of a soccer team or OT or PT. There's just other things that our kids are involved with that are also important. And so really having parents understand that there are providers that have different parameters as far as what that service might look like. And so you can ask those questions to make sure that whatever that provider necessitates as far as service hours, that you are in line with that and can accept that. And that can be part of your agreement.
Really good advice. There are logistical considerations as well as all the clinical considerations that you talked about earlier too. Anything else, Christine?
I think that's great, Jesse. And I love what you're doing, because I think so many of our parents don't have an opportunity to learn how to get services provided for them, or how to go about asking providers questions. And so I think this is really a great idea that you're putting into place for parents to have an option and have the information that they need to get the best resources that they can for their families.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. I think it's a really important thing, and I think in general, as people, we are nervous about things that are unfamiliar to us or things that we don't know about. And so the more information that we can put out there that's consumable for just the general public, especially for these families who have kids with autism or who are going through the process, the less scary it is, I feel, and the more likely people are to be empowered to go and get services that are going to be effective for them. So I appreciate the compliment, and I just think it's such an important thing for families, and hopefully we can help a lot of people.
And ABA is really a great intervention. It's a great service for a lot of families. It's not for every family. And so really finding a good provider and somebody who practices ABA in the way that you would like. I think there are discrepancies in some of the way interventions are implemented. It's kind of like going to the dentist. You can have a really great dentist, and you can have a dentist that is maybe a little bit less skilled or does things a little bit differently than you would like. And so there are providers that are different. There are providers that have different skill sets. And so I think it's just like choosing another medical professional. You should ask questions and be informed on what kind of services you're going to be provided. It's so important to have the right fit when you're dealing with children, and you want their growth to be quick and swift, and you want it to be a good experience. So be picky.
Yes, I think that's maybe we change the episode title to that. I think that's such great advice, and I think being picky is exactly what our families should be doing and should be empowered to do.
Yeah.
Christine, thanks so much for taking the time today. I think we learned a lot, and I think just your wealth of information is invaluable. So thank you so much for being with us and just being willing to just to impart all of your experiences on us in this arena. I just really appreciate you taking the time to come on with us.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. It's been my pleasure.
We were given the diagnosis. We were told, we recommend ABA services. We had never heard that term.
Yep.
And so that was new to us. And so, but then we were told, it's a 3-month waiting list. And the company we were going through said, what we want to do is we want to get you guys into parent training first. And then we want to get you into ABA services and help, bring that all home together. And so we're like, okay, great. And we were told we were going to be put on the list, and 3 months went by and we didn't hear anything. So finally I called, and it had turned out that we had slipped through the cracks and we hadn't been put on the list. So then it was going to be at least another 3-month waiting list for getting into services or getting started for intake, because we weren't on the list and there were a lot of families ahead of us. We at that point, so we got on the waiting list, and then like a month later we called and we were like, can we get started on the parent training? And the person that we went through, whoever we talked to, I don't think they really understood what we were asking for, because when we went in to meet with the counselor that they put us with and we explained what we were looking for, the counselor kind of got a puzzled look and said, well, I don't really do that. That's not my area of expertise. So, I'm not sure how we can help you further. And so we kind of walked away from that kind of jaded, I think, a little frustrated, because, we were told here is the things that we want to do, and it wasn't happening and we weren't getting anywhere. Meanwhile, we were dealing with a very violent child who was kind of scary at times, and we didn't know what to do because standard parenting techniques that we'd used with our other 2 children, they weren't working at all. And we were at our wits' end for sure. And so it took like 6 months just to get started on anything. And so that was kind of frustrating. I wish that I had called earlier. I wish that I had checked up month 1 and just verified that we were on the list and that things were progressing. I wish that I had done more on that.
And definitely, again, one of the things I'm just going to sound like a broken record on is asking the questions, because we actually found out a couple years later that they had our email address incorrectly in their system. So I think that led to some of the problem, because they kept saying, well, we're emailing you stuff. Aren't you getting this stuff? And you should be able to see these things in this app that we have, this program that we have. And we're like, what program? Well, we've emailed it to you. No, you haven't. And so, making sure that everything is right, and asking for like test emails or just checking in on an ETA, because even after we got put back on the list, we still had to call back after that, like 3 months. And I think there were still problems then. We were still not on the list or something, but at that point we're like, we've got to do something, or we're going to have to find somewhere else. And so they finally pushed it through and just got us started. But, don't be afraid to be that advocate for your child, because you're the one that's going to be able to make the strides and push to get that help. The companies have so many people that they're trying to help that they're not going to be able to check with everyone. And unfortunately, people are going to fall through the cracks sometimes. So the parents need to make sure that they're staying on top of it as well.
I just always really appreciate Christine. Here are some of the takeaways that I had. It was hard to boil them down, but here's what we've got. Most companies have waiting lists, and so it's okay to get on a bunch of them. You can look at the different proclivities that different companies have and research them as you're on those waiting lists. And you can always decline if you decide that company isn't a good fit. Don't settle for a provider who can't meet your needs just so you can get started with ABA. Some providers might be great, but might not have experience or the training to support you and your family and your individual needs. So it's okay to be picky. Oftentimes, kids with autism, they'll have comorbidities, meaning they'll have things like ADHD or oppositional defiance or other diagnoses. And it's important to find a provider that has experience or familiarity with the other disorders or the other issues that you may be experiencing or that your child may be experiencing. It's okay to be empowered to ask questions. If you have questions for Christine, send them over to us. We'll get them over to her. Our email address is autismnavigationpod@outlook.com.